Well, it's been a minute since I've done a video, hasn't it? Much longer than that, to be honest, but with life getting in the way for the past while, I haven't had much time to get to the editing bay and create videos about video games, so I apologize for the massive delay in releases. Thankfully, things are slowing down for me, so now I can get back to a bit of content creation, starting with this script that I had written over a year ago, and subsequently needed to be updated at some point. So, I hope you enjoy what I have in store for you all today. In sports, a dynasty is a team that establishes a pattern of dominance over an extended period of time. The NFL's New England Patriots won more than 10 games out of 16 played in a season every year for over 16 years, winning the Super Bowl 5 times during that span. The NBA's San Antonio Spurs won more than 50 games out of 82 played in a season every year for over 17 years, winning the NBA Finals 5 times during that span. Truthfully, the label of dynasty is usually anointed by those outside the team because the label itself is subjective, but that's a conversation for a different time and topic. The only thing we should focus on is how a team becomes a dynasty. Singular, sustained dominance at their craft for a very long time. If we bring this school of thought to video games, then the Super Mario series has been a dynasty for over 37 years and still counting. There isn't another video game series as prestigious and as recognized in both the public and critical mind space as the Super Mario series, saving the industry from the video game crash of 1983, revolutionizing 3D gaming to give the SparkNotes version of the series accomplishments. Mario, and by extension Nintendo, have built a dynasty in the video gaming world. So it makes sense that the gaming media has given the series its flowers over the decades and placed the majority of the series' games on the respective greatest of all time lists, or GOAT lists. Let's spend today's video diving into these lists, and let's find the average ranking of every major game in the Super Mario series. In a way, it'll be a neat glance into how each Mario game stacks up against each other from a ranking standpoint. This won't be a top 10 list though. We're going to go down the timeline of release dates for each major game instead, starting with the most recent games and traveling all the way back to 1985 to the one that started it all. Consider this more of a retrospective than a competition. So with that in mind, let's run through how we're going to discuss today's topic. To start off, let's refer back to the guide I've established for the channel on how I chose lists to pull data from. In total, using VideoGameCanon.com's list database, I've pulled 29 greatest of all time lists going all the way back to the year 2000 that fit this criteria. The wide majority of these lists came from Video Game Canon, though I did come across one recent list that wasn't in the database, but fit this criteria, so I added it to the pool. I'm not going to mention which list ranked what game because the point of the video isn't to critique any publication's list. We're treating each ranking as an objective stat. But it is important to note, these rankings vary pretty widely depending on the game and the recency of the list, so we're going to break up the discussion into 3 sections. The modern era, which will group every Super Mario game from the Wii U and above, covering the 8th generation of gaming and everything afterward. The motion era, starting at the GameCube and covering the distance between the 6th and 8th generations, where a number of notable games in the series were released on the Wii. And the golden era, covering everything from the 5th generation and below, and also containing the games that made the Super Mario series the juggernaut it is today. Funny enough, this is the first video I'll be using a box score to keep track of the stats for the games in this series, and I already have to make a slight adjustment to the presentation, so bear with me really quick. The total list, which is TL on the box score, will be 29 no matter what, but because not every game was released during the date range of the list, I had to keep track of how many lists qualified for each game. So instead of the total list box looking like this, I'm going to add a second number to the box, making it look like this. This is the number of qualifying lists I was capable of using based on the game's release date. It doesn't mean that game placed on every list, it's just how many possible lists I could have used. One more amendment I need to make, the handling of G.O.A.T.com's list. Back in my original consensus video way back when, I noted I was choosing to leave off G.O.A.T.com's list because of questions regarding the ethics of its community. Looking back, this isn't really fair and is kind of a weak reason to omit a qualifying list because the list does meet my criteria, so I'm going to add it to this data pool and for future videos going forward. So with that out of the way, let's travel through the years and take a look at the Super Mario series list performance, starting with the modern era and working our way back through time. A few preliminary stats before we start. First, the number of total placements for the entire series, which we notated as TSP, is 112, and the overall series average, noted as OSA, for the Super Mario series is 23.9. While the vast majority of these lists are top 100, there are a few top 50 sprinkled in, so there's a little bit of variation in that final number. But that's still a pretty high bar to clear, so let's see where the majority of these games land. Just as a reminder, the meaning of each statistic abbreviation can be found in the description, but here's a quick glance at the legend for the box scores. Now with that said, Let's finally dive in. We start out with our most recent game in the timeline in the faraway land of the before times, 2017, and kick off with Super Mario Odyssey, resident Nintendo Switch GOAT contender. Based on our criteria, you'd think that Odyssey wasn't going to see a whole lot of traction considering there are only 4 possible lists out of 29 that it qualified for based on the cutoff year, but believe it or not, Odyssey landed on 3 of them. So in a small sample size considering the game just became eligible in 2020, Odyssey rounds out to an average rank of 47.3, ranking as high as number 28. Once again, because the game is so new, there were only 3 total placements for the game, but it'll be interesting to see where the game will be seen in another 5 years or so, considering where the game stands right out of its 3rd year of eligibility. Super Mario Run is technically, in the most technical of technical terms, a Super Mario game, at least according to Wikipedia's glossary of Super Mario mainline games, but it didn't place anywhere and is really more a casual mobile game than anything else, so I didn't expect it to get any love really, so we're going to leapfrog that one and go on to the next game in the timeline, Super Mario Maker, which, considering how heavily promoted the game was in the lead up to its release, does count as a mainline title despite its clear differences with the rest of the series. So at that, we see that, yikes, 0 placings. Yeah, I didn't mention this before, but not every game from the Super Mario series is going to place on any list. Which makes sense, of course, considering the dataset only goes back to the year 2000, and Mario Maker was only released in 2015, which made it eligible for only 9 of 29 total lists. So yeah, not much left to say about Mario Maker in the grand scheme of GOAT contention, but considering its presence in the online streaming community, its presence is still felt in certain pockets of the gaming landscape. Moving right along, we travel to the year 2013 with Super Mario 3D World. With the added knowledge that now some games might not actually place anywhere, will 3D World suffer the same fate as Mario Maker? Not this time. 3D World squeaks in with 2 placements on a total of 13 eligible lists, with an average ranking of 37 and peaking as high as number 26. Low volume of placements again, but still an extremely bullish ranking based on that peak. I think this can offer a neat discussion centered around how some publications view these specific games more highly than their peers would agree with considering the lack of placements anywhere else. But for now, we're more focused on the nitty-gritty stats themselves, not who ranked what where, so we can save that discussion for another video. Overall, a low volume, high efficiency showing from 3D World, which sometimes is just enough to win. Sometimes. We round out this era with 3 final games, all released within a year of each other and ending, or starting, the modern era for this exercise. New Super Mario Bros. U, New Super Mario Bros. 2, and Super Mario 3D Land. Why group these 3 games together? Because not a single one placed in our dataset. With the absolute earliest eligible list being from 2015 and onward, none of the 3 games managed to get picked by any publications for considerations on any of their GOAT lists. The new Super Mario Bros. Sub-series has been having a bit of a rough go at it so far, which is a shame considering how many resources have been put into the series. Which leads to a larger observation of mine digging through these lists. Even with the benefit of a decade of time for legacies to develop, the modern era has proven to be pretty light on prestige. Interestingly, the most prestigious game released in the modern era is its most recent one, Super Mario Odyssey, which again is in constant Nintendo Switch GOAT game contention, but actually rounds out to a lower overall average ranking than Mario 3D World, a game released 4 years before, but landed on 1 less list. We'll need to set some time aside for a discussion on what the balancing of time and list placements should look like, but just taking a look at the raw numbers, what can be observed is that more Super Mario games missed out on being ranked altogether than landing somewhere. An interesting discussion for another time, but for now, let's keep going. We're now into what I call the motion era, the period that spans the length of the GameCube into the twilight years of the Wii, a time period where some of the series' most important games were released. And for 2010, we start off with an absolute titan, Super Mario Galaxy 2. The very definition of a super sequel, I've seen debate in the past for which Galaxy game is superior to the other, and there are legitimate arguments for Galaxy 2 to come out on top. These publications in our dataset only seem to kind of agree actually. On 15 eligible lists, Galaxy 2 landed on 6 and rounded out an average ranking of 52.3, significantly lower than any average we've seen so far, but also features our highest peak we've seen too, peaking at number 8. There seems to be some wide variation with just how prestigious Super Mario Galaxy 2 is depending on the list. Considering the game has a reputation for being extremely difficult at points, I wonder how much that plays into account for its lower prestige. But regardless, Mario Galaxy 2 was a terrific way to close out the motion era for the Super Mario series. We're in need of a redemption arc for the new Super Mario Bros. Sub-series. So far, none of the games have placed in our dataset, so now it's up to new Super Mario Bros. Wii to break that trend. one of the highest selling games for the Wii, released with its own bundle. Can it do it? No! Still no placements. They're running out of time and games to land a placement here. Otherwise, if it doesn't, that would be really, really, really embarrassing. Okay, not really. Gaming Goats are a high bar to clear, but we're not done with the series yet, so let's put a pin in that for now. So, it's time to talk about the other titan for this era, Super Mario Galaxy. This game is certainly a GOAT contender for the Wii, or rather the GOAT contender, as it's the most likely frontrunner depending on who you ask. But with regards to our dataset, does this reputation hold up? Yes. Yes, it does. We've come to the first game in our video to clear the overall series average bar, as it hit 5 placements out of 19 eligible lists, peaking at number 3 with an average ranking of 21.8. One less list placement than Galaxy 2, but way higher rankings among its 5 placements. It's honestly stunning to see just how far apart the two Galaxy games are. Much lower variation between the average ranking and its peak leads me to think that Galaxy 1 is just more highly regarded than the sequel, just plain and simple. The fact that it landed on less lists is still noteworthy, but a more than 30-point difference in average ranking is too significant to ignore. Debating between which game is better than which is 100% subjective, of course, so we'll never get a solid answer between the two, but it's good to see we have a clue at which direction consensus is facing at the moment. Two absolute GOATs for sure, but one GOAT is more GOAT-y than the other. One last chance. One more try for New Super Mario Bros. To land here. Back to the game that started off the entire sub-series, the original New Super Mario Bros. For Nintendo DS. A game that stands as one of the top-rated handheld games for its year and is one of the highest-selling games of all time. Survey says... a strikeout. With this ending the New Super Mario Bros. Line of games, the sub-series ends without landing a single placement. Again, it leads me to wonder just how much investment Nintendo should be putting into these games, considering they're apparently not seen as anything more than just nice on the GOAT scale. Decent video games, gym rats, lunch pill kind of games, first one in, last one out, hard-working games. But nothing spectacular. Oh well, it's a shame. The final game of the motion era is one of the most, I guess, controversial, for lack of a better term, games in the Super Mario mainline series. The only thing really controversial about this game is how much love the game deserves, because there are many fans who consider this their favorite game. The reputation for Super Mario Sunshine is worthy of its own case study by someone smarter than me, but for now, I guess a good way to describe it is that it has a major cult following. Now, how this translates to our GOAT list dataset, ouch! This one's gonna be hard. Yeah, Mario Sunshine, believe it or not, has never landed on any qualifying top 100 list since the 3 years after its release. Again, these are lists that I picked based on my personal criteria, but 29 lists is a pretty sizable sample size. A game as highly regarded among the fanbase as it is, this apparently doesn't reflect the feelings of the critics who rank these publication lists. Call it the Rotten Tomatoes critics audience score dichotomy, I really don't have an answer to why this is. But unfortunately, our second era of Mario gaming will begin with another game that whiffs on landing any placements. At the end of the day, the motion era was an interesting time for the Super Mario series, buoyed mostly by the two Mario Galaxy games. But the games are so strong in their own right, they've managed some serious and lasting traction in the overall GOAT discussion within our dataset. Not bad at all for the motion era, and a stronger overall showing than the modern era. Well, so far at least. But now, we're on to the mountaintop of the Super Mario series. The era that helped establish Super Mario into a worldwide dynasty. This is the golden era of the Super Mario series. Here, every single game we talk about is eligible on all 29 lists, so we have the absolute maximum chance to observe the legacies of these games based on the collection of these lists. We're in the home stretch now, so let's dive into the numbers for some of the greatest video games ever made. We start at the point where the golden era ended, in 1996, with Super Mario 64 dragging the video game industry kicking and screaming into the world of 3D. The impact this game had on the industry was seismic, one of the watershed moments in history that showed us what the interactive medium of video games was capable of. As it turns out, this impact was not lost on our dataset. A staggering 25 placements, with an average ranking of 18 and seeing our highest peak so far of the video at number 2. Insane showing from Mario 64, but nobody should be surprised it's this highly regarded. This is the type of game you consider for the Mount Rushmore of gaming titles, based around its impact. Expected, yet still shocking to see this type of success laid out in numbers. Exactly the kind of showing you expect from a Super Mario game in its golden era. A slight dip now, as the next two games to talk about, Super Mario Land 2 and Super Mario All-Stars, will unfortunately have to keep short since neither game landed on any placements. Granted, All-Stars is really a remaster collection rather than a full-blown Super Mario title, But for good measure, I did check the status for Mario Lost Levels in our dataset, which is the only new quote-unquote game from the collection, and it also did not land on any placements. While Mario Land 2 is just an unfortunate case of not being selected for our lists. Not much left to say about these two games, so let's just move on. On to the quote-unquote sequel to Super Mario World, Yoshi's Island. As an aside, I find it interesting how this game has been seen as less of a sequel and more as the start of its own franchise as time has gone by. But I digress. How did this game fare? Fairly well, actually. 12 placements out of 29 chances, peaking at number 16 with an average score of 52.2. Close to 30 years later, and Yoshi's Island is playing 500 ball for its legacy. Not too shabby. There's an interesting caveat to this game's average score, but we'll go into it later in the interesting observation segment. But Yoshi's Island, good showing. Now we move on to an absolute behemoth of video game history. One of the most beloved games ever, Super Mario World Legacy is all but set in stone as an all-time classic. For Super Mario World, it's not about if this game placed, it's about how high it placed. And how high did it place? An absurd average score of 16 average ranking on 22 placements out of 29 possible lists. 3/4 of all total lists with that high an average is incredible, making it possibly the most successful game in the series on pure volume alone. And for good measure, it also peaked as at least one publication's #1 game of all time. A fantastic showing that should come as a surprise to absolutely nobody for one of the greatest games ever made. We have another short entrant here, unfortunately. Super Mario Land, Mario's first foray into gaming on the go, didn't impress the critics enough to see placements on their lists. It's a fine game for sure, but considering the games that are sandwiching this one in our timeline, Mario Land just doesn't stack up, relatively speaking. Only 3 games left. The OG Super Mario Bros. Trilogy is all that's left in the timeline. The journey in time we've gone through has led us to the quintessential games in the platforming genre. So, what do the numbers tell us? Well, for starters, they tell us that Super Mario Bros. 3 is an absolute world beater. An average score of 15.7 on 18 placements, peaking at number 2. Not bad for a game that's technically a movie tie-in. Alright, jokes aside, Super Mario Bros. 3 is one of those games with a golden reputation. Often considered the greatest game the NES ever produced, and on the shortlist for the platforming game Mount Rushmore, even before crunching the numbers, it just seemed like there was no way this game wasn't going to produce big numbers. And it delivers with the single highest average ranking in the entire series so far. Once again, just like Super Mario 64, expected, unsurprising, and absolutely dominant. That sounds about right for Super Mario Bros. 3. Now for the middle child. Honestly, and to speak personally for a second, this is a game I don't exactly enjoy playing myself, so I wouldn't have been too shocked if it didn't actually place anywhere. Even though it's still considered a classic NES game, and I figured that would be unrealistic. Well, I wasn't as far off in my assumption as I thought after crunching the numbers. Only 2 placements, peaking at number 30 and an average ranking of 55.5. You know, this is almost as surprising to me as Super Mario Sunshine Shutout. Only 2 placements for not Doki Doki Panic is a fascinating showing, especially considering we're past 35 years later and have had ample time for data collection. I guess the game's reputation is a bit more in flux than I originally thought. Final game in the timeline, and the one that started it all. Super Mario Bros. Just saying the name out loud and I'm thinking about the World 1-1 music. That's the kind of effect this Greek god of the gaming industry has. Now, about those numbers. Like Mario World and Mario Bros. 3 after it, it's not about if it's going to place, but how high it's going to place. And wouldn't you know it, we have the highest average rank of the entire series, edging out Super Mario Bros. 3 by almost 5 whole points at 10.97. And of course, peaking at number 1. Thank you G4 for that. But a respectable volume 2 at 16 placements. All things considered, this number of placements actually seems a bit low to me. Every list I studied didn't use one game per franchise rule, so it's not like it was being arbitrarily boxed out. Some lists just outright left it off. But, oh well. Bottom line is Super Mario Bros. Boasts the highest average ranking of the entire Super Mario series, which is a fitting conclusion for the game that saved the entire industry. Now, with the timeline complete, we can see with our own eyes that Super Mario Bros., at least based on average ranking, sits at the top of its own series as the anchor of Nintendo's dynasty. Welp, the timeline is done, the numbers have been crunched, but we're not totally done yet. There are a few interesting observations I'd like to mention before we go. For starters, there was one list that served as a major outlier for a game that forced me to make an adjustment. Game Informer's 2009 list was a top 200 list, which isn't a problem in itself. I don't have any sort of cutoff limit to how many games can be on a list for inclusion. But the interesting thing here is they ranked Yoshi's Island at number 185. This single placement affected the entire average ranking for the game, so I thought it was worth mentioning. So when you add it to the list, Yoshi's Island average ranking drops from a 52.2 to a 63.3, a staggering 11-point drop based on one list. Because this list was such an outlier, I decided to have a with and without for the box score, but again, I thought it was interesting enough to mention. Now, let's take a wide overview of the games in the box score. Here's what it looks like chronologically from earliest to latest game in the series. Now, if we arrange it like this, we're ordering them by average ranking, where again, we see Super Mario Bros. At top, followed by Mario Bros. 3, Mario World, Mario 64, and Mario Galaxy rounding up the top 5. But what if we arrange them by total placements? Now all of a sudden, Mario 64 is the new anchor, followed by Mario World, Mario Bros. 3, Mario Bros, and Yoshi's Island tying up the top 5. The point I'm trying to make here is there are a lot of ways to arrange the data, but now it's time to ask a question. What does this mean for the consensus for the top game in the series? Is Super Mario Bros. 1 the undisputed number 1 because of its highest average ranking? Well, what about Mario 64, which is 7 points worse, but with 9 more placements? Is Mario 64's average ranking score actually stronger overall because it achieved this score on higher volume? Then there's also Super Mario World, which threads the needle of being a higher ranked game than Mario 64 and boasts similar volume of placements while being only 5 points worse than Super Mario Bros. Which game has the strongest case for the consensus series GOAT? In my view, a debate is always going to be just that, a debate. Numbers and data can be introduced in a number of ways to fulfill a talking point. It's ultimately up to the player to decide what is their favorite. Especially with video games, which is arguably the most subjective art form in the world considering the level of interaction required just to explore the medium, there is never going to be a correct answer. Now, I only sought averages and numbers for my data, and being the amateur statistician I am, I prefer to observe data rather than help create it through formulas. So truthfully, I'm not sure whether I would agree if Super Mario 64 has a stronger overall case because of volume, because it's only something I can observe, but not decide definitively. My numbers aid, not tell. Well, at least for this video. Considering this is a timeline, I only really aim to show off data for the Super Mario Bros. Series, but for next time, we're going to look at more targeted results. Whether it's through total number of placements, highest average, any other specific statistic, we're going to look at something we can observe, but can also give us an answer. Thank you all for watching. I hope you're having a good day so far. If you're watching this at night, I hope you're having a good night, and I hope to see you all next time.